These guys in the Bean and Grain Project are heroes in the community. In conferences, they have groups around them, you know, listening to them. These guys have been farming for 40 years.
Tom's now invited all over the United States to talk.
They're transitioning towards...
They're transitioning into organic,
and
they're transitioning into food.
This is Peak Moment. We are living at a peak of human innovation, information, wealth, and health. But we're also at a peak of population and consumption, with rising temperatures and declining resources fueled by cheap oil and gas. Peak Moment Television, bringing you examples of positive responses to energy decline and climate change through local community action.
Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. I'm in Corvallis, Oregon, and I'm here with Harry McCormick, who is the founder of Sunbow Farms, an organic farmer for decades, and the co-founder of Oregon Tilth, and Dan Armstrong, who's a novelist and writer from Mud City Press, author of Prairie Fire, which I got to tell you is a great story. We're talking about food, local food. Part of your novels, Dan, were about the whole food system globally and kind of how vulnerable we really are to the market, and we're depleting the soils. I mean, this is not a happy situation here, particularly as our populations grow. So you had mentioned that a bit about how did you get to know Harry and this Bean and Grain Project?
It's kind of a remarkable story, but essentially it began with this novel. I wrote this novel, Prairie Fire. It's about the grain market and actually what the problem is with growing grains on huge, large-scale industrial farming. And I was invited to a sustainability conference in Iowa. And the first night of the conference, we had a keynote speaker by the name of Ken Meter. He's an agricultural economist out of Minneapolis. And he gave, the conference was in Iowa, like I said, and so he gave us a story about Iowa. And it was a story I'd never heard. It was that Iowa at that time was importing 98% of the food that they ate. This is the state of Iowa, which is a huge farm state. They can grow most anything, but they've been so almost into a monoculture state of mind because of the dynamics of the global market. It makes any particular area of the United States focus on the crop that they grow for the highest profit and grow only that. In Iowa, it's pigs and corn. They used to grow lots of other things. Well, I found this completely, one, enlightening and mystifying, and I ended up coming back home to Oregon, and I said, I wonder if that same thing applies here. And I did a little research, and I discovered, my God, Oregon, even this Willamette Valley, which is essentially a garden valley, we're importing 98% of what we eat also. And I'm going, this is impossible. And so I said, you know, this doesn't make sense to me. I did a little independent research. I went back through the stats of what's been grown in this valley for the last 50 or 60 years. I discovered that in the 50s and 60s, we grew mostly wheat here. And grass seed was a secondary crop that really was prompted into 70s and 80s and 90s into a monoculture for this valley. That's grass seed.
Lawn type grass
lawn,
seed?
also forage, but it's so this
Golf
is
courses.
You know, we have 1 million acres of cropland here, and 650,000 acres of it was for grass seed, and some of it was for wheat and some other products, but mostly we were doing this. And we couldn't feed ourselves. It seemed ludicrous. So I began doing this research, and I discovered, hey, we can produce all the different foods we need here. What's the problem? If we want to relocalize, which I guess I should say I've studied peak oil, I've studied climate change, and I thought the best response I've heard is relocalization. And if you apply relocalization to the food system, that's a real starter. That's where this all begins. And so I'd come to this conclusion thinking I'd come up with a great idea. And I sent an email back to Ken Meter in Minneapolis. I said, hey, Ken, you know, I'm finding out the same thing that you said in Iowa is true here, and it's blown my mind. How can I activate on this? And he says, well, you should check out the 10 Rivers Food Web and speak to this man, Krishna Khalsa. And I said, oh, he just said Krishna. He didn't remember his last name. And so I'm thinking, oh, that's great. In Eugene, there's probably 30 or 40 people named Krishna. I'll find him in a second, right? So I went to a conference 2 weeks later, asked the guy sitting next to me, you ever heard of a guy named Krishna? And he goes, oh yeah, I got his phone number right here. So I called up Krishna. He was out of town. I sent him an email, and I told him, you know, essentially I was interested in grain and the production of wheat in this valley. And he wrote me back a letter telling me what Harry McCormick was doing. Harry McCormick had stumbled onto this. Well, he probably didn't stumble. He probably logicked it out. He'd been working on this for 2 years. I remember reading this email about what Harry was doing, promoting the bean production of beans and grains in here as an alternative to grass seed. And the hair stood up on my arms and on the back of my neck, and I said, boy, I have to meet this guy. He is doing what I consider the smartest thing in the world, and that is relocalizing the food system. So,
okay, Harry, over to you.
So yeah, Ken had been working with 10 Rivers, it turned out. We had hired him to come in, and we had had some research from Larry Lev at Oregon State University, which he publicly said 2% of our food is local here, and this is in the Willamette Valley, which is way more localized than any place else in the United States, pretty much. And he came up with this 2% figure. This is after we've been working on this stuff since way back in the early 70s. Right. So this is how far we've gotten with all the farmers markets we've put in and all the people that we think are doing our co-ops, you know. Yeah. And he came up with 1.8% when he did his research. So it's somewhere around 2. I think in some households it's probably, we have a whole group in the alternative community that's probably more like 5, maybe 10% of our food is local. Some of us that live on farms, it might be more than that. So when we started 10 Rivers Food Web, we set a goal for localizing this 3-county area that stretches from the coast to the Cascades, localizing the food in that area, and it's about 300,000 people we're dealing with. And we set a goal of having 30% by 2012.
That's 30% locally grown, locally consumed.
And locally consumed. So I can tell you that at First Alternative Cooperative in Corvallis, part of our work, and then there's been other people climb on the bandwagon here in the last few years. So we have a program called Local 6, and it actually is food from 6 counties that are around us. The co-op says that 35% of the food going through the co-op now is local, in that definition of local of 6 counties, which is about a 50-mile radius either side of Corvallis. When we started 10 Rivers, I started reading some stuff that actually came out of California. A man named Jason Bradford, who was working out of Willits, and he had done an assessment for Willits in which he'd stumbled onto the fact that he used to figure 90% of an emergency food system is beans and grains. And I'm familiar with the fact that we are in an emergency called the Long Emergency, and there's a book about it. And I went, okay, in our area here where we have more farmers markets per capita than other places, maybe 80%. But it's still really big that every meal you sit down to is basically grains and beans. And when you start looking at school food menus, which we did, we're looking at institutional menus in the hospitals. We're looking at what people actually eat. It's grain and bean based, and some edible seeds. And these can all be grown on a lot of this land that got put into ryegrass back in the late 60s and on through the 70s and 80s. We can use the same machinery. We can use the same cleaning devices. And these guys these guys are professionals. They know how to do this stuff. But they don't know how to do organics yet. And they don't know that there's a local market. In fact, they totally distrust that there's a local market, which is why everything goes out internationally. And what happens to these guys when they do grow white wheat, which is an overwinter wheat, we plant it in the fall, and it gets shipped out internationally, hundreds of thousands of tons of it from here. It's costing these guys somewhere between it depends whose figures you look at, but somewhere between $6 and $7.50, $7.80 a bushel to produce that wheat. And they're lucky on the international market if they can bring in an average of $5 a bushel. A bushel is 60 pounds. So, yeah, so they're losing their shirt growing something that is needed worldwide because it's manipulated the way Dan's book said. It's an international economy that's been being manipulated from the top. So what happens if we put in a local system where the economy is localized and we start charging what this stuff is worth to a local group? And
what it costs to produce it.
What it costs to produce.
Which means that it's going to cost more.
It's going to cost more for people here to...
white bread in your market.
Yes, yes. So fortunately, I was already working with a 10,000-acre farm who had come to my classes. The two women that were the organic part of the farm in their heads were trying to convince Harry Stallford, the other Harry, to take 10,000 acres of grass seed, convert it into food, and make a majority of it organic. And they've been hammering him for 16 years. He came to a meeting here on the farm, and I'll never forget that day because at the end, Dan was at that meeting too. At the end of the meeting, he was about to walk out, and he looked at me and he said, "What should I do?" And I said, well,
wow.
if I were you, you have 125 acres around your house that your wife won't let you put chemicals on, and it's been cleaned for 3 years, so it can be certified organic, and you think it's full of weeds because it's leftover ryegrass and meadow foam and clover. That's a green manure crop, and if I were you, I would disc that down and I would break it up into 20-acre plots and I would plant it out in 5 different bean crops.
And some wheat. And if you remember that same meeting, the same meeting, he slammed the table and he stood up and he said, "You can't grow organic hard red wheat in this here." And now that's his bread and butter.
Really?
So we'll tell you the whole story here. So he at that moment he looked at me and he said, "What should I do?" He walked out the door and I didn't know what he was going to do. And he went home that afternoon, climbed on this thing he calls a tractor, which you have to climb a ladder to get in. It has 8 wheels. He put a 35-foot disc on the back, and he went out there and disked that whole field down. And then he had to go to Europe to a big seed meeting, so he left word with his seed salesman to order organic, 5 different kinds of beans, organic. Wow. The women told him what they wanted. And when he got home, the stuff was popping out of the ground, and it kind of blew his mind. And the field, we have pictures of all this, the field that first year with that green manure crop in was fairly clean. There was almost no weeds in it. We happened to have a fairly decent summer that year. We did have a little bit of frost in early June, but the crop actually almost matured. It was a little late planting it. So I'm just telling the story because it kind of tells you where we're at here. So I get a phone call in September from Willow, his wife, and she says, "How do we know when beans are ripe?"
Yeah, these farmers are learning step by step, day by day.
Pull one and break it open and put the bean in your mouth, and if it crunches, that's the only way I can tell. So she did that, and she determined that the 20 acres of garbanzos and the 20 acres of pintos were ripe, and that the rest of the field wasn't. So she left word with Harry, as she took her kids to school, to get the windrower in there and windrow half of the pintos and half of the garbanzos, because we really didn't even know how to harvest them on that kind of scale.
Right.
And Harry went and got one of his, I don't know, his 8 windrowers, 10 windrowers. He's got a bunch of them. Got in, he probably turned on the music, and he ended up windrowing the whole 100 acres. He left 25 of lentils because he knew those weren't done.
Oh my God.
And some of them weren't ripe.
She comes home, and there's all these beans laying on the field. And she says, "How are you going to get these up?" Because he was thinking a windrow was going to be like ryegrass, which is usually about that deep when it's set in a windrow, and the combine comes through and takes the seed off. He's dealing with stuff that's like this, and when you hit it with the windrower, some of the beans were already on the ground, and when you hit it again with the combine, some more beans are going to go on the ground. So he went through with the combine. He managed to get 15,000 pounds of garbanzos out of there and 6,000 pounds of pintos, and about that much was left in the field. And the other ones, they harvested some of them, but they were too green. So then we have these beans that have been, 1st of September, we have moisture here. We have these beans that have been laying on a field in the mud, and they've got mud on them. And they're going to go to market. So how do you clean a muddy garbanzo? Nobody knows. So Willow has the seed salesman start calling around, and he finds out that somebody will clean this amount of beans for $2,500. Was it 25? Yeah, it was $2,500. And in the process, he found a bean cleaning machine. It's called a bean polisher for $2,500. So they got those beans cleaned, and they bought the machine, which now sits on that location. And we started moving these beans and found out the market is horrendous.
Horrendously good.
Horrendously good, and people are paying $2 a pound for them. Meanwhile, the economy is crashing.
But the beans are still...
The beans are great. The beans were there, and at the same, Dan brought up, the same year they grew a plot of red wheat, which they had tested a little bit the year before, and they had this plot of red wheat to start selling. And that's another whole story, but the protein level was up high in it, 14% protein. So anyway, the beans are sitting there ready to sell, and we're getting $2 a pound. The red wheat's going out. At that point, we were getting $2 a pound for the wheat too, because we were direct sales off the farm.
So what does that mean a bushel? That's $120 a bushel, as
60
opposed to
pounds.
6. If you're selling by the pound, 60 pounds at $2 a bushel.
And the economy's crashing, and the ryegrass they harvested that year wouldn't move. Nobody in the world would buy it. These guys have no money. They're all going broke. And Harry comes into a meeting that we held in their office over there, and he said, I thought you guys would want to know what's going on. The only thing that's moving off this farm and keeping a cash flow going to keep these people in the office is the beans and the grains.
Yes.
And
so another part that's elemental in this is the backdrop is rebuilding the food system.
Yes.
So we start by producing more food, but the foundation to a food system is the
soil.
Staples. Well,
and
the
it's the soil.
But in terms of the food itself, it's the staples. It's the wheat and the beans.
80%.
And so if you're in an area and you're thinking, wow, how do we re-stimulate our own food system? Think in terms of the staples first, because you can grow your vegetables and your tomatoes, but they represent a very tiny percent of what we eat.
That actually has been one of my concerns. Is we've got lots of folks doing the vegetable gardens, the kitchen gardens, the small farms for fruit and nuts and vegetables. But the staples, you're right, that give us...
The real transition also, and I'll tell another Harry Stalford story, and he knows I tell these all the time. So I've got him now lecturing on biology, which is really fun to listen to a chemical farmer lecture on biology to a group of scientists from the university last summer. But that same summer, he was out going through those organic fields with the wheat, with the combine, and where there had been clover and where there had been cover crops, he was watching the dial on this combine, and it was giving him 150 bushels an acre, and they usually get 100. And on the red wheat, 40 bushels is pretty standard, and when he had tested it, he was getting 10, but now he's up to 40. He came in after he saw this stuff on the combine, and he said to Will, there must be something to that soil biology. And a couple times in meetings where we've been, where other chemical farmers are sitting there, they all know him. All these guys know each other. And he lectured them on soil biology. And he's done it in front of the university people too. And what he's saying is we're using way too many chemicals. I pulled them out, he pulled them out of his system. Even his chemical fields are about a third of the chemicals that people normally use. He won't even fertilize in the fall, which they recommend, because he found out it was a waste of money. He didn't have fertilizer that went through the drill one year because of mud, and that crop did as well or better than the stuff he paid all the money for, so he quit doing it. He's an innovative farmer. And the other thing that I think is really important with this project, with a guy like Harry or like with Mike and Clint down the road, with Tom Hunton down in Junction City, these big farmers have never been given any credence for anything. They just go out there and drive machines and they do this work and they sell a crop. These guys in the Bean and Grain Project are heroes in the community. In conferences, they have groups around them, you know, listening to them. These guys have been farming for 40 years.
Tom's now invited all over the United States to talk. This is a guy down in Junction City.
They're transitioning towards...
They're transitioning into organic.
And
they're transitioning into food. And there's a lot of people that have been watching this off the website that Dan runs.
So look, this whole story, for what it's worth, if there's more to this than we'll ever get into this discussion, but I've documented the whole thing on Mud City Press. If you go and look for the Bean and Grain Project, you'll see year by year, we do about 3 meetings a year. We clock them, we check the stats, how many acres have we converted to organic, what are we growing, how are those particular beans growing, which ones work best in our climate. It's really a kind of a farm community science project. Well, Harry calls it the big experiment.
Big experiment, that's what it is.
It sounds like it, because you're all learning as you're making these changes.
Well, one of the things that just happened down at A2R, the guys have been, down the road, it's an 820 acre farm down the road from me here. About 600 acres of it's owned, the rest is leased. Most of these farms, these big farms, like Harry Stalford's land is all leased. They only own a little piece of that, 10,000 acres. So to innovate on leased land is kind of iffy. These guys down here, watching what happened this last year with their crops and the money flow that started happening, they came to me this fall and they said, we want to put compost tea on, but we can't afford to buy a $10,000 compost tea brewer. And I looked at Clint and I said, you guys are farmers, you got a shop? And he said, yeah. And I said, you can build one, let's build one. How big a brewer do we need to cover your acreage? And we started doing some calculations and we came up with at least a 1,000-gallon brewer we needed, which doesn't even exist on the market. Because they have to be able to go out with the big booms that used to put the chemicals down. They're driving those across the field and out it's coming compost tea. So they went, I told them where to go. They found a tank, a 1,400-gallon tank. They found pumps and plumbing and everything. In a week, they had this thing built for a little under $3,000. And then we didn't know how to put the food in because mine out here, I know the recipes, but we're dealing with, I got a 30-gallon brewer for this farm.
So you might take a moment, Harry, to describe what
compost tea is.
Do you know what it is, Jim?
Basically, this is the simplest an advertisement, actually. How do you put 25 pounds of compost on 65 acres and have the biology that's in that compost across those whole 65 acres? And the way you do it is you use these machines called compost tea brewers, which actually were patented originally in Eugene. So they come from here. And Dr. Elaine Ingham of Soil Food Web, and if you people on the film want to see where to go to Soil Food Web, and she has an e-zine and you can see the whole, there's also an International Compost Tea Council, you can go and see the whole history of this. But the last 10 years, this tool allows for us to do an 800-acre farm with a 1,000-gallon tea brewer running for 3 or 4 weeks. They were able to get tea this fall on 600 acres.
So you take the compost and
small amount of compost, it goes into the water. The tea making machine is a bubble machine, kind of like a fish tank, but it's much more exact than that. It strips the biology out of the compost, puts it into water where it doesn't want to be, and then we have to feed it with something like liquid fish fertilizer and humates is what they're using down there. And the stuff came back from the lab. You got it. It's all optimal. They started spraying. So here you see these huge rigs with the big wide tires that go across these big commercial farms. Never going to have chemicals in again. It's going to be all compost tea. It started this fall. I went down a couple of weeks ago and looked at those crops, and I'm driving by a lot of crops that are the same. Their stuff looks so fantastic. Excellent. And when Shelby came down with the bread that you have over here to do a film last week, we stood out in front of those fields. This bread this is the first week it's on the market, and it's made with flax, wheat, and oats from this farm I'm talking about down the road.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to throw in a little plug for Harry's book, The Transition Document, because
tell us about that.
Just to make sure the audience knows, you know, the idea, Harry's talked about the biology. When you look at compost, what you're really doing is you're creating a living entity, and it has nematodes, microbes, bacteria,
fungi,
all of these things are in that.
Chemicals.
It's living things. And then when you do the compost tea, you're literally taking the living part out, putting it into the water, and then spreading that living part back out onto the soil. So, and these little living things start building the soil. They start making the most efficient use of everything, and they actually work with the plants. But this is in the book.
Tell us the book. Tell us the book.
So the transition document, actually this is the 4th edition of this. Dr. Alan Capular, who's a world-class genius, and I got together. I actually wrote the thing, but he did a scientific overlay on it, and we did it back in the 90s for Oregon Tilth. And part of the reason we did it was because we realized that people we didn't have a system yet for doing organics. And we described the microherd, which is now talked about as a soil food web. We described a lot of things that have become kind of popular in the organic community the last 10 years or so. But one of the things that we did do when we did this, and it was me that pushed this, was we looked at residues from previous farming practices left over in the soil and coming up in the foods. And this happened because I was executive director of Tilth when this happened. Some of our big growers that were selling baby food squash, the labs were finding leftover chloridane and leftover dieldrin pesticides in these squashes. OSU didn't know, Oregon State University didn't know where these were coming from. They actually did tests for us, and we finally determined together that they were coming through the roots. We didn't know how deep this stuff was in the soils. We didn't know how long it lasted. I did a lot of research in the old 6th floor of the old library, which was Chemical Haven, and found that everybody knew that this stuff hung up for hundreds of years.
Oh, wow.
And the reason we have a 3-year waiting period, this got asked to me again the other day, a 3-year waiting period to get certified organic, is because some of the organophosphates we found in our research were typically breaking, some of them break down fairly fast, but some of them would hang up 3 to 5 years, and we picked 3 years as kind of a way that most of them will be gone. Oregon Tilth doesn't have to do this anymore, but we paid, our farmers paid to do this research on all of our farms. And the first round that we did 240 farms, we found 40% of them had residues that were left over of chlorinated hydrocarbons that would be there for hundreds of years. And we knew already that those would come up into squash, beets. All the data is in this book. That's the first chapter of the book. The rest of the book is how do we change all this? This stuff can be grown out of the soil biologically, like any oil spill or anything else. The reason the oil spill in the Gulf went away so quick as much as it did go away was because of the biology that happens to be there that eats oil all the time because there's seepage from those oil beds. So toxic waste management with biology is one of the ways that we thought about rebuilding these soils. Now, one of the things we've done with the Bean and Grain Project, when we go on these big farms and we've done testing where they've grown all the grass seed, we're finding soils that are in pretty good shape, actually way better shape than most of the class 1 soils where commercial vegetables have been grown or where commercial fruits have been grown, because they didn't use chlorinated hydrocarbons. They don't have DDT sitting around typically.
Strawberries.
Strawberries, fruit orchards. We have one orchard that's been certified for years. The floor of that orchard is probably still 19 parts per million DDT. If you put a potato in there, it would have to go toxic waste dump. But the trees, we found out, block it. It doesn't come into the fruit. There's a ton of information in this book that doesn't exist anywhere else because nobody's funded it. So one guy at Davis started to do it and they defunded him. So.
We've mentioned transition a couple of times. We talked about transitioning this valley into a local food system and transitioning from grass seed to food. But the transition document is really, to me, a much grander concept. It's the transition of agriculture out of chemicals. That's what the transition is. And I think Harry, in this introduction, which I totally love, essentially gives us a history of how this has evolved, how it's evolving, how 5 years ago we didn't know what we know today, and how 20 years we knew even less. And you know, this process, this transition, is real. It's still a learning thing. And what's cool about the compost tea,
it's a tool.
Is the fungi, because that's a
that's what holds our calcium. The calcium levels have dipped 30 to 60%, depending on where you are on the planet in the last 100 years, and that's because of the way we do agriculture, the fungicides and the tillage. It's the biology is a big level of the whole thing that needs to transition, and it goes right back to peak oil. A big part of peak oil is how our agriculture has run since we discovered oil. The reason we have land-grant universities is because of the discovery of oil. They wanted to push chemical agriculture onto the world, and they still do. That's how they're funded. This university over here gets incredible amounts of money from Monsanto and DuPont and stuff. Fortunately, over the years, we've been able to get a little bit more organic, quote, sustainable stuff in there, but that's a big problem.
You're watching Peak Moments, locally reliant living for challenging times. I'm Janaea Donaldson. Buckle up your seatbelts. Join us next time.